I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Skrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
I'm very excited, David, because in a couple of weeks, on Wednesday, March 30th, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 9:30 Pacific Time, our guest will be Jesse Singer, author of There Are No Accidents, The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster, Who Profits and Who Pays the Price. A couple of months ago, we did a thing with Richard Panchik, the author. It was a very successful Zoom episode, so I'm looking forward to this one too.
This is an opportunity for people to watch the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as it's being recorded on Zoom.
You get to see how the sausage is made, and it's pretty tasty. Just go to ralphnaderradiohour.com to sign up to be in our Zoom audience. Ralph Nader, there's a button on the right side. You'll see actually a picture of Jesse Singer. So go to that and sign up to be in our Zoom audience. And guess who else we have here today? We have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. Today we're going to have a program like no other. We're going to have half of it on the way the laws obstruct voting and the counting of voting. And then we're going to have a section on how the laws obstruct candidates from getting on the ballot. So voter suppression and candidate suppression and how they connect with one another.
That's exactly right. On today's program, we're going to be looking at the state of voters' rights in America. Our first guest, radio legend and civil rights activist Joe Madison, is the perfect combination of a talker and a doer. He ran the Detroit office of the NAACP in the 1970s, working on some of their landmark civil rights campaigns, including school integration and busing. He started his radio career in the 1980s, and he's used this platform to continue the work he started in Detroit. He's taken his radio show to Cuba, South Sudan, and the White House. He broke the record for world's longest broadcast, a 52-hour marathon that raised more than $200,000 for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Now, his latest cause is also his oldest cause, voting rights. He recently ended a 70-day-long hunger strike protesting voter suppression. We look forward to speaking with him about the ongoing threats to voting access in America and his long advocacy career. After that, like Ralph said, we'll get an update on the fight to expand access to the ballot for minor parties from a friend of the show, Richard Winger. He is the publisher of Ballot Access News, a national monthly newsletter covering developments in ballot access law and third parties in general. Hopefully, he has some good news from his work in the courts, Congress, and various state legislatures to remove ballot restrictions. If we have time, Ralph will answer some more of your listener questions. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's talk to one of the foremost advocates for voting rights. David?
Joe Madison, also known as the Black Eagle, is a human and civil rights activist and talk radio host. He hosts the Joe Madison Show on Sirius XM Urban View, and Talkers Magazine has named him one of their 100 most important talk radio hosts 9 times. Mr. Madison is also the author of Radioactive, a memoir of advocacy in action on the air and in the streets. He also just came back from a ceremony where Speaker Nancy Pelosi signed the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill, which passed overwhelmingly in the House and is now on its way to President Biden's desk. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Joe Madison.
And thank you, David. I can't tell you how thrilled I am. I've had Ralph on my show. My God, how many years have we been, talking? And it's great to hear your voice. And I appreciate this opportunity. I really do.
Well, it's mutual, Joe. Thank you very much for coming on. And David could have also mentioned that years ago you were head of the NAACP chapter in Detroit in the midst of the civil rights movement. And so you've been a thinker, a talker, and a doer. As I say very often, there's an old Chinese proverb which says, to know and not to act is not to know.
Wow, and you have been a role model for that action. I mean, we sound like a mutual admiration society here. But, I can't even begin to tell your audience, and I don't have to tell your audience this, the impact that you have had on our lives for years and the courage. One of the things I've always said on my show is that all movements require sacrifice. Somebody once said, what's the difference between a moment and a movement? All movements require sacrifice. And the movements that you have participated and created over the years, I hope the younger generation, I always have to talk to them, I hope they understand the sacrifices that Ralph Nader made in creating the movements that have really changed our society in many ways. So I just wanted to say that to you directly.
Thank you very much, Joe. Well, we're going to talk about going backwards into the future with the suppression of voting rights. So I wanted to ask you, you were on this extended hunger strike, protesting the lack of action in Congress on 2 voting rights bills, obstructed, of course, down to the teeth by the clenched jaw Republicans, and reflecting some renegade Democrats like Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, who don't want to get rid of the filibuster, regardless of the consequences, to millions of people who want to participate in the electoral process. You've done these hunger strikes and fasts throughout your career. You've done some with our mutual friend, Dick Gregory, who did this again and again. And I've often wondered what kind of effect it has. And let me explain that, Joe. People who do hunger strikes for civil rights are almost uniformly advocates of nonviolence, not only morally, but they don't think it works, and it backfires, and it harms a lot of innocent people. But they're willing to put violence to their own health. And I've got to tell you a quick story about Cesar Chavez. Near the end of his life, he was on a hunger strike for the farm workers in Arizona. He had done most of his work, as you know, in California. And I called him up, and he was really getting weak. And it was, I think, about his 26th, 27th day. And I said, Cesar, there's only one Cesar Chavez. You can't do this to yourself. Why are you doing it? He said, I've got to get media publicity for my people. I said, that's quite a reflection on the media, but you're not getting media publicity. But I'll try and help you. So I started calling the networks. And I called one network, and I got a producer, and I said, you really have to cover this. This is newsworthy to begin with in terms of what he's trying to do and his sacrifice. And the producer said, how many days has he been on this hunger strike? I said, around 27. He says, call me when it reaches 35. Yeah, you see, they want more tragic drama.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm asking you, given that the Republicans are incapable of receiving an act of conscience, a demonstration of conscience, these are not the Republicans I knew in the 60s and 70s, but they are off the wall. Clearly, in my book, the worst Republicans in the history of the Republican Party on almost every single human issue: workers, environment, pensioners, patients, consumers, tenants, you name it. Why did you think that you could reach them or reach those 2 renegade senators?
Well, there's a couple of things that I'll share with, and everything you said I had to take under consideration, and I had learned down through the years joining Dick Gregory on hunger strikes. The reason I decided to do it was to join in coalition with individuals and organizations that were protesting, members of the Congressional Black Caucus. They were actually protesting in front of the Senate chambers and getting arrested. You had National Action Network, Al Sharpton. I had participated in a rally on Capitol Hill. Thousands of people showed up. And then there were various other organizations. Ben Jealous, he had several arrests in front of the White House to try and convince President Biden to speak out more forcefully on dumping or at least changing the filibuster. NAACP had done their annual report cards, and one of the issues was the filibuster, and there were several Democrats, not just Manchin from West Virginia and Sinema from Arizona, but there were several Democrats that had not signed on to changing the filibuster, and they weren't getting a lot of attention. I didn't feel that there was enough pressure on the Senate and or the president. So I decided actually to take a page out of Dick Gregory, Cesar Chavarez, you name it. I've had a lot of role models when it came to this. And you're absolutely right. You risk the potential of not getting any attention. But one thing that Cesar did not have that we have today, and that is social media and a number of cable shows. So immediately, and by the way, he didn't have his own show. So I had my own talk show, and I had people who believed and knew me down through the years like we've known each other, and they know that I was serious. Now, I should also point out, I got calls from friends like you, said, why are you doing this? Joy Reid from MSNBC said, Joe, you can't do this. You know, we need you. Why are you harming yourself? I got folks who came at me with sincere affection, love, and concern, and basically tried to talk me out of it. But again, I knew something dramatic had to be done. And I just had to commit myself to this hunger strike. And so I ended up 72 days of no solid food. It was juicing. What I used the recipe Dick had used over the years, just simply liquids, juicing, and that's what I did. It did get attention. Matter of fact, a group of students from Arizona, Sinema's state, they joined in the hunger strike. I had ministers that said, I'll join. And people started responding. I think because this issue should have transcended politics, because you're absolutely right. The Republican Party, I think it was during George Herbert Bush's time, they extended the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. And not one Republican in the United States Senate would support what turned out to be one bill, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis bill, and they merged it. But let me quickly say, Ralph, that the Democratic senators kept meeting, they kept caucusing, and they would come on my show. I've actually had several Democratic senators call me and said, keep doing your hunger strike. Now, this has got to be unheard of. Keep doing your hunger strike. And eventually, all but two, and they needed those two, all but two ended up agreeing to change the filibuster so this bill could be passed. I should also say to you, I ended up getting a letter from President Biden thanking me for the hunger strike. I mean, I framed this sucker. I mean, I got it, and I'm laughing because I think it's the first time in history that the president of the United States has embraced, somebody making a sacrifice. But it does go back to what I said earlier about your efforts. You are a role model, and I meant that seriously.
Well, Joe, we're very worried about your health. I mean, you suffered physically from this, dizziness, nausea, insomnia.
But I had anticipated all that. I knew I would. I mean, that's the point. I knew what I was going to go through. First of all, as somebody reminded me and said, look, you're not this 35, 40-year-old activist you were. You're 70, I'll be 73 in June. Here you are, 72 years old. And you're right, but I knew I was going to go through this. And let me tell you a really interesting story. My wife insisted, well, you're going to have to get a physical, or else I'm not going to agree that you do this. I went, I got a physical. And even the doctor said, are you sure you want to do this? Okay, and I just told him, I'm going to do it. I always remember this conversation. So I'm in the car driving home, and my wife looked at me, sincerely looked at me and said, "Are you telling me that you're willing to die for this cause?" And I turned to her and said one word, "Yes." And that was the end of the conversation. And I meant it.
And then you see, if Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, heard that conversation, he would have let out a ghastly chuckle. These people are cruel beyond belief. The only reason they're in the Congress, Joe, is the weakness of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman or John F. Kennedy, they would have landslided these people. Landslided. They never would have been reelected or elected in the first place. And so let's talk about the Democratic Party. Do they have the intensity in pushing for these bills the way the Republicans have the unanimous intensity in obstructing them? And shame on Mitt Romney, who has his own independent political base, and he goes along like a toady to Mitch McConnell's instructions. Is there an asymmetry in energy and intensity here? And that includes Joe Biden.
You know, I think not. I agree with you. And the reason I'm hesitating, I'm one of these people who always believe you got to make them do it. Look, you know what this whole game is about. It's about power. And that's really what it's about. And so my position with Majority Leader Schumer, with many of the members of Congress, you're going to lose everything. You will lose everything. And I did not bite my tongue. You can't get reelected without us, particularly African Americans and progressives. You can't get reelected. So if you don't do this, you're going to lose the.
It's in their self-interest.
Right. You're going to lose everything.
Yeah.
Well, once again, we got all but two. We got all but two. And so as far as I'm concerned, I agree with this. I don't know why they didn't just, and I'll just use the street term, I don't know why they didn't jack up Joe Manchin and Sinema, because I go like you back to the days of Lyndon Johnson. And that's what was my biggest criticism of Joe Biden. All this talk about, you know, we got to get along, kumbaya, I need him, I trust him. I think he should have grabbed Manchin and used whatever trigger he had, but it may not have done any good. And with Sinema, I don't know what her issue was. So the answer is they certainly aren't the Lyndon Johnsons, and he wasn't perfect.
He knew how to trade off with these guys.
Yes,
because his conversations are recorded and they were played on public radio. We've all heard the amazing way he handled the Southern Democrats during the civil rights struggle.
And none of them wanted to vote for the Voting Rights Act. None of them wanted to vote for the Civil Rights Bill. But you know, he understood. Well, if you want that bridge, damn it, you want that highway. Right. You know, you can't look. I'm not going to sit up here and give you money for a highway, and then what? Then you're going to discriminate about who drives down the highway? You want that bridge? You want that electrical grid? What, you're going to discriminate who gets electricity? You're absolutely right. I did not see that with Joe Biden, but I will quickly say this, Ralph, and that is people said, well, you failed. And I quoted the Japanese admiral who was in charge of bombing Pearl Harbor when, you know, they were celebrating. And he said, no, you know what? I'm afraid all we've done is awaken a sleeping giant, and he is resolved. That's what I think we did, particularly with young people. These folk learned more about how Congress worked, how the Senate worked, what the hell was a filibuster, how it worked. They understood the sacrifice that it had to be made. And now it boils down to this, and that is there's only going to be one way to get those bills passed, and that is getting out the vote. There has to be a major, progressive, concentrated voter registration, and get out the vote drive. That's the only way, because you are 100% right. This is not the Republican Party of years ago, not at all. They are now the party of white supremacists. They are the party of voter suppressionists. In essence, they are Donald Trump's party.
Right. Party of big business, too. Joe, let me try a new approach here.
All right.
I think the reason why they were hesitant with Manchin, because if those two senators turned Republican, they'd have lost the Senate. And,
right.
you know, they were afraid they'd say, okay, stop browbeating us. We've had enough. We're going to become Republican. Suddenly Mitch McConnell replaces Schumer. Now, what about this for an approach in trying to get these bills through? There are 5 Republican senators who are not running for re-election. They have nothing to be concerned about, Trump or anything. There are several Republican senators who used to be called liberal Republican senators. That's Collins from Maine, Murkowski from Alaska. Mitt Romney's got his own independent base, as I said. There are some Democrat senators who pride themselves of working across the aisle. That's like Senator Coons, Senator Carper from Delaware. Why aren't they working across the aisle privately to spin off 2, 3, or 4 of these senators, especially when they got goodies called good works that they can trade off with some of these senators, and especially since some of these senators are going to really go look pretty bad in history as they retire. You know, there are about 8 or 9 of them that they could work on, and I have found no reporter who has ever written about this article, about this subject. And so I don't know what is going on behind the scenes, but they're not having any success. When was the last time you heard major voting rights legislation opposed by every one of the Republicans? 100%. They're saluting McConnell and Trump. So what about that approach? Try to spin off as the election comes close.
Well, that's why you're Ralph Nader, and that's why I have such respect for you. Let me start with the media. I think one of my biggest criticisms with the media, particularly, and I say this as constructive criticism, a lot of these young reporters, they're good at putting words together, but they have no institutional memory of history. And so they don't know to ask or approach the senators and the heads of these 2 political organizations in the way that you just described. I think your approach is right. For the life of me, I couldn't understand Portman. He's retiring.
From Ohio.
From Ohio. Now, you've got an outstanding Democratic senator, my good friend, Sherrod Brown, who I've known for years. I knew him when he was Secretary of State. But, you know, the problem is, and I'll say this, and I may be naive, I think they're absolutely afraid of Donald Trump's base. I mean, it's just that simple. And I'm like you. I mean, you know, Murkowski, I support the John Lewis. I love John Lewis. But then she voted right along. And the Collins, why? Hey, Ralph, maybe they're afraid of being primary and they have to spend all that money. I just think this Donald Trump has this unholy hold on them, and they just simply aren't the kind of Republicans that we knew that was willing to trade off and compromise. It's almost immoral.
There are some Republicans in close races. There are 5 Republicans not running. There are several Republicans who've just been elected, like Collins, and Romney doesn't have anything to worry about. If I were the Democrats, I'd be working overtime in terms of cutting deals with these people, because what have they got to worry about?
First of all, let's go back. You are absolutely right. There are about maybe 5, 6 states right now that need to be targeted. And I mentioned Ohio, Pennsylvania. And I don't see a concerted effort. Matter of fact, I can tell you honestly, I had a discussion this afternoon, while I was over on Capitol Hill. And I had prominent Democratic members of Congress come up to me and say, can you come to a meeting and talk to us, because we're stalled when it comes to a major voter effort this year. Now, how in the heck, how can you be stalled? This is not rocket science. So your strategy, maybe that's the problem. Maybe the Republicans realize that if they're stalled and they don't have an effective, I think we're both right. If they don't have an effective get out the vote campaign, then why should the Republicans do business with them?
Well, the Republicans are taunting the Democrats, saying they don't have a clue as to what the people in America want, and they're taunting them because they saw what happened in the recent elections. The Republicans would get out the vote in Ohio by using people in the neighborhoods, and the Democrats would bring in outside consultants into Ohio who didn't know what the neighborhoods were like. There's got to be a third force here to get out the vote big time. The November election listeners won't be lucky to get 35% of the voters out.
Yeah.
In the off year, as you know, Joe, the turnout is ridiculously low. And there's got to be a third civic force here to get the vote out. And some members of Congress admitting to you that they're stalled. Well, you know what? They're right.
Yes.
They're right.
Yes.
They're accurate, even though it's disgraceful.
It is disgraceful. And you used the word, and that is consultants. I think that they better stop listening to these consultants. I hate to say this, but it's good old, I shouldn't hate to say it. I think it's true. This has to be on the ground. This has to be, the door to door. And they have to understand, they have to target communities. See, they're sitting up here depending so much on the internet. But what they forget, particularly in the African-American community and in the poor, underserved communities, some of these folks don't have Wi-Fi. They don't have the internet. I got in trouble when they had the symbolic crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge last week. And I said, you had thousands of people who showed up in Selma, Alabama. And Selma, Alabama has the lowest, can you historically think about this? How ironic. The lowest voter turnout in the state of Alabama. So in addition to having this symbolic march and everybody trying to get in front of the camera, why don't y'all spend a day or two since you're there and go door to door? And it's really simple. You go to the low voter turnout districts, the low voter registration districts, and you work it. You keep working it. You just don't go in for one day. I did this with the NAACP. Under Ben Hooks, I ran the political action department. Man, we registered people. I remember this. You remember cheese lines when people were getting in line to get these cheese and butter? Well, yeah. We registered thousands of people on the cheese line. Folks thought we were crazy. Well, first of all, it was a captive audience. They weren't going anywhere till they got that cheese. Second of all, we could educate them as to just think about what you're going through. Just think about the fact that, and all of this is political. And we registered thousands of people. I just don't think, quite honestly, they know how to do this anymore.
They use television and social media instead of person to person. And that that violates all the way back to Abraham Lincoln's memo on how to get the vote out. Right on the ground. That's what has to be done.
It has to be on the ground. It has to be on the ground.
Yeah, and they're just not up to it organizationally. That's why there needs to be a third force. The unions also use email. You ask some union members, did you do this and that? Yeah, we sent out thousands of emails. I said, that isn't what I was expecting you to say. You don't organize labor by email. So we have to continue this conversation strategically, Joe.
Ralph, I mean, we need to go on each other's show and educate our audience and see if we can push this from the ground up.
Well, we want to hear from our listeners about how you would get out the vote in the neighborhoods you know. Let's get some ideas from you, listeners. They better realize that what's coming is not just McCarthyism. It's fascism, American style. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sent a message to Congress in 1938 to create a temporary national commission to investigate concentration of corporate power. And in his message, he said, when government gets taken over by private power, that's fascism. So we're beyond McCarthyism. McCarthyism was a senator who didn't have enforcement rights, military or police. What we're dealing here with the Trumpsters is rising fascism. And so young people, you better read your history books and you better wake up, because your voting turnout in their 20s and early 30s is lower than the voting turnout of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. On that note, Joe, how can people get to hear you? Give the contact numbers for the Joe Madison Show on Sirius Radio.
And I'll make it it's Sirius Radio, channel 126, Urban View. Sirius Radio, channel 126, Urban View. And I always tell people, go to joemadison.com. Everything is there. And, you know, I got to thank you for mentioning, this is my first book, man. It took me 11 years. And in it, that's why we called it Radioactive, because almost every chapter is about what we've talked about. And it's all been on the ground, and how I use my platform, I think, like no other talk personality really has.
JoeMadison.com. The book is Radioactive. Joe does the program 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. So you've got a lot of time there to partake in real radio talk, not just blather, not just celebrity massaging, but real talk that affects people everywhere.
And I always ask the question, what are you going to do about it? After you get through talking, what are you going to do about it? Because everybody can do something.
The essential question of democracy. What are you going to do about it? Thank you very much, Joe.
I thank you, Ralph, and we'll stay in touch, man. I really appreciate this, and thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
We've been speaking with Joe Madison. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we've covered voter suppression. When we come back, we're going to move toward candidate suppression. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, March 18, 2022. I'm Russell Mokhiber. On February 23, 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene said that war and rumors of war are incredibly profitable and convenient. What she didn't say was that on February 22, she bought up to $15,000 in stock in Lockheed Martin, the nation's largest defense contractor. That's according to a report from CongressTrading.com. Add this to the list of why members of Congress should never be allowed to trade stocks, said Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Democrat of Minnesota. Greene has repeatedly targeted Omar, insinuating that Omar, among the first Muslim women of Congress, is a terrorist. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Ever wonder why during an election it's so hard to distinguish between various candidates? It may have something to do with who is not allowed on the ballot. David?
Richard Winger is an advocate for more equitable laws allowing access to the ballot for minor parties. He has testified on behalf of these issues in court cases around the country and has been published in journals ranging from the Journal of Election Law to the Fordham Urban Law Review. Since 1985, he has published Ballot Access News. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Richard Winger.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, Richard. I'm holding in my hand your Ballot Access News for March 1st, 2022. You've been at it for 37 years, and it's amazing all the information you acquire. You monitor the bills that are in state legislatures. You monitor the judicial decisions, state and federal courts all over the country. You monitor initiative, referendum, recall. You monitor proposals for rank voting. You talk about what third parties are doing and not doing about these barriers. And there's nobody in the country, no scholar, no professor on elections that comes close to your knowledge of this. And you really do it out of your kitchen in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I got to ask the question that Steve usually asks. How did you get involved in this?
When I was in college, in UC Berkeley in the early 60s, I was just fascinated by activists in the few minor parties that existed back then that actually went out and ran candidates, because they had so little attention, so little prestige. And yet, when I looked at the election returns, sometimes they got big votes. So I wanted to study who votes for minor parties. The only minor parties back then, nationally organized parties that ran candidates, were the Socialist Labor Party, the Socialist Workers Party, and the Prohibition Party. And I thought, well, I'd love to study who votes for those parties in my own state of California. But guess what? They're not on the ballot in California. I thought, well, if a party is organized in the country, why isn't it in the ballot in every state? So then I looked into the ballot access laws, and I realized every state writes its own, and they varied hugely, and some of them were extremely unfair.
Well, you know better than anybody that we are at the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak, when it comes to allowing and facilitating third-party and independent candidates at the local, state, and national level just to get on the ballot so they can give voters more voices and choices. And in Europe, the ballot access laws are very modest compared to the U.S. It's much easier to get on the ballot in European countries by far than the USA. That's why they have multiple parties. That's why the Green Party can get a foothold in Germany. If it got over 5% of the vote, it got over 5% of the parliament. That's called proportional representation. And now, look, they're one of the major parties in Germany. So tell our listeners the differences at the state level, which control, by the way, not only candidates for state office, but candidates for Congress and the president to get on the ballot. How many signatures does it take in a state like Texas and California compared to a state like New Jersey and Massachusetts, or whatever states you choose to pick?
There are 3 nightmare states for minor party and independent candidates in the presidential race. Most states are okay, but California, Texas, and Florida are just nightmares right now. And the Florida case is really, really sad, because in 1998, the voters of Florida passed a constitutional amendment saying ballot access has to be just as easy for any new party as it is for the largest party in the state. So that was a huge victory. And then in 2011, the legislature wrecked it. I don't know if I should spend a lot of time on one particular state, but I just thought I'd single out California, Texas, and Florida are the real nightmares for independent minor party candidates in presidential election. And then if we look at U.S. House, Georgia is the monster. Georgia's law is so bad. It was passed in 1943, the year I was born, 79 years ago, and no minor party has ever been able to comply with the law. And we had a huge victory last year. The U.S. District Court finally struck it down, and then the state appealed, and early this year, the 11th Circuit reversed. It's a shockingly crazy decision. We've filed for rehearing. That's still pending.
Richard, give us some numbers here. Let's say you're running for president in California, Texas, and Florida. How many signatures you have to get? How are they validated? How are they easily struck from the petition arbitrarily by state secretaries of state who don't want third parties on the ballot?
California requires almost 200,000 signatures for an independent presidential candidate. And we had a lawsuit against it in, 2016. And we lost in U.S. District Court. We lost in the U.S. Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals, which was composed of 3 Democrats, said, oh, that's necessary to keep the ballot from being too crowded, even though we had in the case evidence that in the entire history of ballot access, no state that requires more than 5,000 signatures ever has a crowded ballot, where crowded ballot is defined the way Justice Harlan defined it, more than 8 candidates. Justice Harlan didn't think that having 8 candidates in the ballot for a particular office would confuse anybody. After all, almost every American goes to restaurants. You got a lot more choices than 8 for entries.
Well, before we get into what's gotten good about ballot access and what has gotten bad in all these decisions that you keep reporting in your newsletter, Ballot Access News. Tell our listeners the value of third parties, starting, way back, say with the 1840 Liberty Party, and what they proposed, all these third parties who never won a national election, and what their value was.
Yes, throughout all U.S. history, every historian agrees with this. New parties, minor parties, often very weak, introduced new ideas into the system, started people talking about them. The Liberty Party of 1840 was the first organization of any kind, not just the first party, but the first organization to advocate the idea that the U.S. should abolish slavery. Now, of course, we take that for granted. We don't realize how radical that was, because the people who were against slavery back then never dared to suggest that it should be abolished throughout the country. They just concentrated on trying to stop it from expanding. So even in the North, the Liberty Party's message was considered so dangerous and controversial that their speakers were frequently chased out of town, not even permitted to speak. But because they ran candidates who toured the North, not the South, they got the idea going. And that's just a perfect example of what new parties can do. There's so many more, but that's probably enough.
Yeah, give us some examples in the 19th, early 20th century.
Okay, well, we take all these reforms for granted. We don't realize that somebody had to think them up first. Setting rates for the railroads was a whole new idea in the United States, because before that, the whole concept that the Congress should pass a law telling some company how much to charge for its product it just hadn't been thought of. So the Greenback Party and the People's Party suggested controlling the rates that railroads could charge. And of course, that was enacted into law fairly quickly. And then we had women's suffrage, outlawing child labor, Social Security. All these things were first suggested by minor parties, and they all got enacted.
Right. Progressive tax insurance, the 40-hour week, even the initiative referendum recall. Well, in your newsletter, you have description of legislation that would ban ranked choice voting. Why don't you explain ranked choice voting and what's going on there with the obstructors?
Ranked choice voting is 100 years old, and some people don't like it, some people do. But the point is, in almost every state, cities are permitted to decide if they want to use it or not for their own elections. Why in the world the legislature should get into the business of passing a law telling cities you can't use this, even though the cities want to? It's hard to understand why they're doing that. I don't really understand why Florida and Tennessee are doing this.
Well, other than rules that specify what a qualified political party is, how many signatures an independent candidate has to get, one of the more pernicious offerings in recent years by the obstructionists is called the top two, or now in Alaska it's the top four. And this is where in the primary, listen to this one, listeners, in the primary in California, there used to be the different parties would have their candidates. Whoever won the primary for the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, would then go to November for the general election. No, the duopolists didn't like that. So now they have a top two, which means that the top two signature getters in a primary in California, they're the only ones who go to November. And they just passed one in Alaska, which is the top four, which means that in almost all the cases, isn't this right, Richard, that the small parties never get to November?
That's true. The two states that have used top two for the longest are Washington and California. And in all the 10 or 13 years for each of those states, there's not a single instance of a third party candidate placing first or second in the primary, except in races where one of the major parties didn't run anybody. So there's no third parties on the ballot in November, except in those strange races.
Well, some people think that's prima facie unconstitutional, because that basically says to third-party candidates, you can run for election, you've got a chance to win, but you really don't have a chance to win because you're overwhelmed by the number of votes that the two parties get in the primary. It's like one general primary, and if you come in third, you don't go to November. Or if you come in fifth in Alaska, you don't go to November. Have there been constitutional law challenges?
The Washington State case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The lower courts had invalidated the top two system. The Supreme Court, in a decision by Clarence Thomas, said, we don't think top two violates freedom of association. We are not ruling on the ballot access aspects of top two. So they sent it back to the lower courts, who thought, oh, gee, this means top two's fine, and they upheld it. But we still have a chance against it. In the Washington State case, after it was remanded, the Washington primary was in August, and the Ninth Circuit said, well, it's true, the minor parties get to run in August, but not November. But that's not a severe burden, because running in August is practically as good as running in November. But they said it would be an entirely different thing if the primary was in March. Well, that gives us an opening to attack it in California, because in 2024, the primary for all office is going to be in March. It's not this year, it's in June this year, but in 2024 for Congress, it's all in March. So we're going to try again. Based on what the Ninth Circuit said, we have a chance, but we have to wait to file that case until 2023. It wouldn't be right now.
Well, every cruel legislation has plausibility behind it. And the argument, of course, for easy ballot access and getting rid of all these restrictions is it gives more voices and choices to the voters. I mean, who are the lawmakers to say that we're going to make it hard for Jane Smith to get on the ballot because we don't trust the voters who might vote for her? So it's very anti-democratic, to put it mildly. But they do have a plausible argument. It was actually done by initiative in California. I thought the voters didn't understand the consequence.
The legislature put it on the ballot, but the voters passed it with 53% of the vote. So you're basically right.
So what was the argument they used, Richard?
Well, California had a terrible crisis with its budget just before top two was put on the ballot. At the time, the state constitution said the budget can't pass unless it gets 2/3 vote in each house of the legislature. And the Republicans refused to vote for the budget. So for 2 months, we had no budget. We were out of money. The state courts were starved for money. We were paying our state employees in script. And so everybody thought this is horrible. So the way they got top two is one Republican senator said, I'll vote for the budget. They only needed one more vote if you'll put top two on the ballot. And then they claimed that that would cause the Republican Party in California to moderate itself. It absolutely has not. In fact, the Republicans in Congress from California are among the most, extreme, I'll say it that way.
And of course, the argument was that it would produce more moderate candidates. I mean, like, what business do they have defining moderate candidates as the exclusive occupant of being on the ballot? You might say, well, this is really abstruse stuff. When you start reading it, it just sparks your intrigue. It sparks your sense of curiosity and indignation. I mean, you just cannot believe what these people think up. You can see it in what Richard reports. Like on January 24th, the state Supreme Court of Michigan struck down a 2018 law that says no more than 15% of the signatures submitted could come from a single U.S. House district. This meant that once a certain number of voters from a particular district has signed a petition, any more signatures from the same district are invalid. That was the League of Women Voters versus the Secretary of State. And then they fool around with the deadline, so they don't give you enough time to collect signatures before the primary date. So there's all litigation about that. And when the people try to change it by initiative, they put in all kinds of roadblocks there. Even if they win an initiative, in some states, it has to be ratified by the state legislature. So one of the major reforms to get rid of this stuff, Richard, is a federal uniform ballot access law for candidates running for Congress or the presidency. What's the situation? Has Congress or anybody in Congress ever proposed that? And what do you think of that?
In 9 sessions of Congress, we had a wonderful bill to outlaw restrictive ballot access law for federal office, but it never passed. Congressman John Conyers of Detroit introduced it in 1985, 87, and 89. And then Congressman Tim Penny, a Democrat from Minnesota, introduced it for 2 sessions. And then Ron Paul, Republican from Congress, introduced it in 4 sessions, but it never got out of committee. But in 1998, Ron Paul pulled a floor maneuver and he got a vote on the floor of the House to attach the ballot access law to another election law. So at least we got a vote, but we only got 63 yes votes out of the 435 members. I started the whole newsletter in 1985 just to promote that bill. And it's too bad that we don't have anybody in Congress now who's even willing to introduce it. In that score, we've gone backwards. We did better in the 20th century than this century.
Well, it was much easier in the 19th century to get on the ballot. And I understand before the Civil War, you got on the ballot if you could print the ballot. If you went to the printer and printed the ballot in some states, you were on the ballot. Is that correct?
Until 1888, all ballots were private. A voter was free to make his own ballot and cast it. That was legal. Most voters didn't want to bother with that because Americans elect an awful lot of offices. So most Americans would just get a ballot from their favorite party and that would save them the work. But they were free to scratch out names on that party printed ballot they didn't like and put in somebody else. So there was no such thing as a declaration of candidacy, a filing fee, a petition. There was no way the government could stop people from running for office. There was no way the government could stop people from voting for whoever they wanted. So it was much freer. It's ironic that as voting rights in this country generally has expanded since the 19th century, on the matter of voter choice, we've gone backwards. And what really broke my heart was in 1992 when the US Supreme Court said it's constitutional to ban write-in space, because in the past, 20 state Supreme Courts had said you must permit write-ins, because after all, we have to preserve the ancient right that the voter can vote for anybody he or she wants. But the Supreme Court washed it all away. They didn't even acknowledge the history. It was a terrible decision written by Byron White.
I remember when I was running, Oklahoma didn't allow write-in votes. I think Oregon didn't. D.C. said, okay, you can write in a vote, but we're not going to count them unless it makes a difference in the contest between the Republicans and Democrats. So for all practical purposes, they didn't count them. Thank you very much, Richard. Again, you can get this newsletter. Go to richardwinger@yahoo.com. And the shortcut is just use Google, Ballot Access News, and everything comes up. It really is an insight into political science that you don't study about in college and graduate school. There are professors who subscribe to this and look at the detailed information with awe as how he can collect all this information all by himself off of his kitchen table. What a heroic citizen you are, Richard, and we're going to keep revisiting this as we get closer to elections. Is there anything else you want to tell our listeners before we conclude?
In fairness, there's some wonderful other institutions that really make my job a lot easier. And when you say that, I just feel like I have to give a shout out, especially to the National Conference of State Legislatures. They have a wonderful webpage that finds and tracks all the election law bills. And boy, I'd be in trouble without them.
There's the League of Women Voters. There's Oliver Hall, who I know you talk to often with. He's won quite a few of these ballot access cases in recent years. But you're the fountain of information, and we're very grateful for you doing that year after year. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Richard Winger. We will link to Ballot Access News at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
We have time for one quick question. It's from a listener called Hayes, and the subject matter is runaround for my U.S. Senator, as well as criminal justice reform. He says, hi, Ralph. Thanks for your work over the years. I contacted Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania back in early 2020 to explore the introduction of legislation to remedy a criminal justice reform issue. After many back and forths over about 2 years, their office has told me that the avenue to having my legislative fix explored and introduced is through contacting the Senate Judiciary Committee. Essentially, I was told that Senator Casey's office can't help me. Am I being given the runaround? I don't see why Casey's office couldn't help me draft legislation and introduce it to the Judiciary Committee. What do you advise?
This is another evasion that is now used by members of Congress. He's your U.S. Senator, Hayes, and he shouldn't be trying to shove you over to the Judiciary Committee, whose staff is not a political staff in the sense they're worried about votes and elections. And, you know, they're very likely to tell you, go to your senator, that we can't represent your recommendations. We get our recommendations from the senators, and they get it from the voters. So it goes from the voters to the senators to the committee. He's trying to get you bogged down in a bureaucracy that is befuddled as you are in not getting a straight answer from Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania. So give him a lecture in congressional civics here. He is your senator. The Judiciary Committee does not represent you the way he should.
And he's a Democrat.
I want to thank our guests again, Joe Madison and Richard Winger. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, you can get it for free by going to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history. And be sure to check out their latest program on how litigation on brain trauma is changing the future of football. All that and more at tortmuseum.org.
Ralph wants you to join the Congress Club. To get more information, go to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website, and in the top right margin, click on the button labeled Congress Club. We've also added a button right below that with specific instructions about what to include in your letters to Congress.
And Wednesday, March 30th, 12:30 p.m. Eastern, our guest will be Jesse Singer, author of There Are No Accidents, The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster, Who Profits and Who Pays the Price. Go to ralphnaderradiohour.com to sign up to be in our live Zoom audience. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we'll welcome health journalist Vidya Krishnan to discuss her new book, Phantom Plague, How Tuberculosis Shaped History. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you get a sense that candidate rights help voter rights and voter rights help candidate rights. They both support each other.
Hi, this is Jimmy Liebert, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we save some of the interesting odds and ends from our recording exclusively for our podcast audience. First, we continue our conversation with radio host and activist Joe Madison.
We have something now, this social media. You know, Ralph, I was with Steny Hoyer today, and I say this because it's interesting. And I was in this waiting room, and there were like 4, 5, 6 newspapers, actual newspapers. And I said, I'll be damned, I haven't picked up a physical newspaper in I don't know how long. And I was going through it, and I said, wow, I didn't know about this story. I didn't know about that story, because we're now fed, we're actually fed through the internet and through social media what they want us to have. I mean, and I just made the decision, I'm going to start subscribing to the actual paper, because when I wake up in the morning to do my show, I got 4 hours and I've got 3 producers, and they're saying, what about this story, that story, this story, that story? And I'm actually fed the stories and the things to talk about. And too many people, because it's on the internet, or that it's in their hands on their device, they believe it. People they're not critical thinkers. They believe whatever the source is that they're getting at that time.
You know, Frank Moreno, who's a talk show host in New York between 1 a.m. and 5, tells me he gets a lot of his material from my column. I said, boy, that's a new one, Frank. I never heard that. You might want to go back to nader.org and see a lot of the material that never gets in the newspapers. But you're right.
Never.
You know, if you don't read the print newspapers and you just look at the newspapers online, you're missing things because the newspapers have things that are not online for the same newspaper.
Let me give you this morning as an example. There's this, I don't know if you've heard of him, Pastor Mark Barnes. He's an African-American Trumper, crazy as a bedbug, has zip credibility. And he actually announced that if he gets elected in the 6th Congressional District of South Carolina, and folks, if you're from that district, watch out for this guy, that he was going to create a committee. Now get this, the Un-American McCarthyism Committee. Now, I'm not kidding you. And nowhere in print media is that. Nobody's talking about this. He's going to introduce a bill if he gets elected to Congress to, in essence, bring back McCarthyism. Now, here was my problem this morning, Ralph. I literally had to explain to the younger generation what McCarthyism was.
They have no sense of history whatsoever.
Yeah, I had to explain to them, and what it did in blacklisting people and the impact that it had. And then let me also go back to the criticism, the honest, fair criticism of the DNC and the Democrats.
I have a quick question. At least 19 states have passed 34 laws restricting access to voting. What really keeps people from voting? These Republican voting laws or corporate Democratic candidates who stand for nothing? If people really want to vote, will these new laws keep them home?
No, they won't. Let me tell you something. And we saw that in this last election. I mean, hell, a pandemic didn't even keep most of the Black community at home. How do I answer your question? And I want to be as direct as possible. We need to understand there's a group that formulated by an ex-Trumper, ex-aide to Donald Trump, and they would call themselves the Heritage Action Group, something like that, but they are a spinoff of the Heritage Foundation. And they pulled together all these mega donors, and said, we need you to finance our voter suppression laws. And we're going to make it difficult for people to vote. And they created boilerplate legislation. Now, I think it's more than 19 states. From what I understand, there are 49 states that have introduced voter suppression laws. And, keep in mind, they don't have to suppress millions of votes. All they have to do is, in some cases, just a few thousand. That's why when Ralph was talking about, on the ground, most of these elections are won by very thin margins. And let me tell you something else that they did, because it's not just the voter suppression laws. They targeted African-American talk shows, and particularly terrestrial radio, and my show was targeted. And we end up getting what we call these trolls. Voting doesn't count. Democrats are taking advantage of you. There's no difference between the two. Why are you bothering to vote? And that was drummed. It was almost every call, every other call, every hour. And we realized that they had created a troll farm. Now, this is where the big money comes in. And these folks were being paid to do this. Now, I got to tell you, it stopped. And I'm afraid, though, they're going to gear up again. So to answer your question, they changed the laws just enough to discourage people. So again, Georgia, they created a law. So if it's a hot day and I decided as an activist, you know what, I'm going to buy some water and go out and pass out water, I can be arrested. Now get this, in Florida, we worked to get former felons the right to vote in Florida. It was a public referendum that was put on the ballot. 80% of Floridians supported it. It became law. The governor, DeSantis, and the Republican folk ended up repealing the law. And one of the reasons was it would have allowed 1.4 million ex-felons to vote. And they ended up repealing it. Now, once again, that could have been the margin. That could have been the margin. And that's what they're doing. They're just creating enough space, because what the Republicans realize, they cannot win. And what the Democrats better realize, because it cuts both ways, the Republicans cannot win if there is a large voter turnout. The reason that Biden took Pennsylvania was Philadelphia. I mean, those folks got out in line in a pandemic. But, once again, you got to stop listening to consultants. It's got to be on the ground. Look what Obama did, how he won Iowa. They kicked his off. They went door to door. They targeted the neighborhoods. See, a lot of folks don't want to go into a housing project. Well, they don't vote there. Well, that's the folks you want to go for. They don't register. That's what I did when I was with the NAACP. We went into underserved areas, educate. It's a combination of voter education, voter registration, and then voter participation. And you have to do all three. And trust me, you won't get 100% of anything, but you certainly hammer it home. You hammer it home and you'll get more people to vote. And the Republicans know they cannot win unless they suppress, particularly the Black community. And they know this.
David, there are all kinds of ways, even if people vote. For example, they have these purge laws. If you haven't voted in the last two elections, you go and vote,
yes. Yeah.
They purge it. So even when they go to vote, then Republicans are getting teams of tough-looking guys to come down to the precincts and hover around and take pictures. So there are all kinds of ways they're doing voter suppression, even if they want to vote. Of course, there are all kinds of trapdoors now on absentee ballot. If you make the wrong pencil move, they dismiss it.
I know it was one place where they have a law. I can't think of the state, where they actually have drop boxes. But guess what? The drop boxes have to be manned by somebody. Now, I never heard of that. The drop boxes have to be manned. In a county in Georgia, I believe Georgia, they had 7 polling places in this rural county where there was no public transportation. They eliminated all of the voting precincts or the voting booths in the Black community, all of them. So they ended up and only had one, and some people have to drive 25 miles one way to actually cast a vote in this county. In Texas.
They did that in Louisville, Kentucky, where they got rid of most of the voting precincts, David, and they had the stadium be one. And basically there were about 3 places in Louisville where you could actually go down and vote. So that's another technique. They get rid of voting precincts on the grounds of budget restrictions, budget concerns.
In Texas,
anyway,
you can use your hunting license as identification to vote, but a student at Prairie View College, a historically Black college, or any university, the student, Black, white, otherwise, can't use their state college identification. They can't do it. In Maine, I think it was Maine, if I'm not mistaken, they ended up somewhere in the Northeast, and you can correct me, but you can find this out. If you wanted to vote as a student, it was almost like a poll tax. You had to own a car.
Huge numbers of ways to obstruct people, even if they make a real effort to try to get to vote. And the lack of adequate public transit with shrinking precincts is another obstacle.
And now we conclude with more from Richard Winger of Ballot Access News, starting with Ralph's observation about the, quote, top 2 state primary laws that affect the development of third parties.
Well, it's probably fair to say if every state had a top 2 law, basically third parties would never get to November and they'd dry up. Who's going to support a third party that can only go to the primary level in the spring and can't go to November? Wouldn't you agree with that?
I do. And in fact, some people are pushing top 4, top 5. But if you look at Washington State and California and all the primaries since they've had it, which goes back 14 years in the case of Washington, the minor party candidates for governor or senator have never come in higher than 6th. Now you might think, well, what's wrong with them? Can't they come in better than 6? But here's what's wrong. There's so many Republicans and Democrats with money and prestige and backing who run in the primary. The press only covers them. The big news attention is who's going to survive among the Democrats and Republicans. And so the minor parties get no attention in the primary at all. There's been some very good minor party candidates in California in the history of the top 2 system, especially the Green Party candidate for governor in 2014. He was the poet laureate of Los Angeles. He had a stellar record. He had been a convict when he was young. He completely turned his life around. He started a big foundation to help ex-convicts. He was a star, but there was not one article about him at the time of the primary. And then, of course, he would have got publicity if he'd been on the ballot in November, but he was washed out in the primary.
You should consider getting this, listeners. It's really fascinating to see what's going on. He has it state by state. In your recent newsletter, you said, Florida, on January 21st, a lawsuit was filed against the ban on paying circulators on a per-signature basis. What? What's that about?
Well, what it's really about is in state after state recently, the legislators are doing everything they can to stop the initiative process. They say it's to prevent fraud, but whenever these things have gone to court and we've presented evidence, paying people per signature attracts professional petitioners. It's an occupation in this country. The professionals do not want to commit any kind of fraud because it'll be found out and they won't be able to do their work anymore. So the truth is, paying people by the signature attracts the best, most careful, most honest workers. And they only say it's to prevent fraud, but they don't have any evidence.
There's a blizzard of obstructions. You can't keep up with it, even if you're Richard Winger. You have to look at all these maneuvers by these lawmakers. It's really quite incredible. I mean, in Texas or Oklahoma, was it? They banned people coming from out of state to help third parties get signatures on a petition so they can get on the ballot. And there were states that said, oh, no, if you have petitioners, they got to be from the same states, like we're not the United States of America. And the courts have been striking down those bans. But give us a brief review of that one.
This struggle to get rid of the laws banning out-of-state circulators has been going on for about 25 years. And we are winning. This is the one area of ballot access law where we are consistently winning in court. But the Supreme Court has never decided that particular issue. So we have to slog it through the lower courts in state after state. It's just taken a long time. You know, New York is really obnoxious. New York banned out-of-state circulators, and the Libertarian Party filed a lawsuit and won. And then the state appealed. In the meantime, the Libertarian Party pulled over 50,000 votes for governor of New York in 2018. So it was a qualified party in the middle of the case. So when it got to the Second Circuit, they said, oh, this case is moot. Since the Libertarian Party filed the case, now they're on the ballot. They don't need to worry about this anymore. So they dismissed the case. Well, then the New York legislature changed the law and removed the Libertarian Party from the ballot. So we have to file the case all over again, which is going to be done in a few days.
We've been talking with Richard Winger, who is the publisher of Ballot Access News. We're going to tell you how to get this wonderful newsletter. It comes out every month later, but we're going to also preview it right now. You can get Ballot Access News for $18 a year, 12 times a year. It's very readable, by the way. The design is such that you can actually read the print, and you can get it by going to box 470296 in San Francisco, 470296, San Francisco, California, 94147, or go to richardwinger@yahoo.com, richardwinger, W-I-N-G-E-R, @yahoo.com. And one thing I like about your newsletter, Richard, is you have a full page every issue, which goes through every state, starts with Alabama, ends with Wyoming, and it has the following columns: 2020 registration total of voters, like California has 22 million plus voters registered. Then you have a column, actual 2022 requirement to get on the ballot. And then you have 5% of 2020 registration totals. And you explain what all these are about. And then on another page, you have the 2022 petitioning for statewide office, and you have the various parties in their own column, state by state. For example, in Illinois, if you're a full party, as you call it, there's no procedure.
Yeah, there's 11 states don't have any procedure for a group to transform itself into a qualified party before the election. Illinois is one of them. That
Right.
means you can't start petitioning until you've chosen your candidate, which is terrible.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a mishmash, and the federal government can't easily establish ballot access for state offices, but they certainly can for federal office. And
Right.
there's no reason why the states can't have an interstate compact and develop a uniform ballot access law. In fact, there are some of these statutes have already been drafted. We're talking with Richard Winger, publisher of Ballot Access News. Here's how you can get it. Again, it's only $18, and go to box 470296 in San Francisco, California. That's box 470296, San Francisco, California, 94147. But she's at station in Berkeley. You'd want this. And it's 415-922-9779 is the phone number. Area code 415-922-9779. And Richard's contact is Richard Winger, one word, at yahoo.com. Well, what are you all thinking, Steve?
Richard, I have a more personal philosophical question to ask because you and Ralph have covered all of the details. Obviously, we're in a stage of democratic decline, or actually, that's my question. With all of the, we've talked about voter suppression, we're talking now about candidate suppression. What is your feeling about the state of democracy in the United States, which was supposed to be a shining beacon to the rest of the world?
It's been horrible lately, but ironically, and I know it's tough to go through your day without thinking about the Ukraine situation. Just in the last week, I'm starting to feel a little bit more optimistic. I'm reading a wonderful book called The Road to Unfreedom, which explains Russia, why it has this tendency to authoritarianism. And I know this show is not about Ukraine, but you did say, how do I feel? And I feel that just in the last week, the free world, and I know that's a hackneyed phrase, but the countries that believe in liberal human rights, they've come together, and all of a sudden authoritarianism looks really bad, really horrible. So I'm feeling just a little bit better. And I know you didn't ask me this, but I really recommend to readers that you get the book, The Road to Unfreedom. It's a wonderful book.
Would the liberal world, as you put it, had the same attitude when George W. Bush and Dick Cheney committed that criminal war of aggression and blew Iraq apart and killed hundreds of thousands of people, millions of refugees? To this day, the country is the object of sociocide. But we have a double standard here, unfortunately. But anyway, we have to keep upholding these standards and hope they spread uniformly around the world.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome health journalist Vidya Krishnan to discuss her new book, Phantom Plague, How Tuberculosis Shaped History. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting